Night in Paris, California always felt strangely quiet. But on this night, the silence carried something else, an urgency that no one could see coming. 13 children lived inside the small suburban house on Muir Woods Road, but the world knew nothing about them. No one knew how they looked, how they sounded, or even how they survived. Because for years, the Turpin family had built a fortress of secrets, and inside that fortress, horror had taken the shape of normal life. Inside the dimly lit house, the air was thick, stale, unmoving, like the atmosphere of a place where time had stopped long ago. The children weren't allowed to move freely, weren't allowed to speak, weren't allowed to dream. They were shadows living between walls, chained not only to their beds, but also to the fear drilled into their hearts. Their father, David Turpin, carried himself like a quiet enforcer. Their mother, Louise, followed him like a devoted echo. To the neighbors, they were simply a strange family that kept to themselves. But no one knew that behind the closed doors, cruelty lived like a permanent resident. The night that changed everything began with a whisper, an idea so fragile that it could break under fear. A 17-year-old girl, trembling but determined, looked around the room where her siblings slept. Most of them were weak, malnourished, barely able to stand. She knew that if she didn't try tonight, maybe she would never try again. She clutched a deactivated phone she'd secretly found. It had no service, no SIM, nothing. Still, she spent weeks trying to make it work, praying that one day it would connect her to freedom. Her heart pounded as she slid open a window she had never dared to touch before. She squeezed through the small gap, her body shaking, the cold night air stinging her thin skin. She looked back only once. The house stood like a silent monster, its darkness stretching over her childhood like a shadow she was finally outrunning. She didn't know where to go, but she knew one thing clearly. If she didn't escape now, she and her siblings would die in that house. Barefoot and terrified, she walked down the street, clutching the phone. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if anyone would listen. But she dialed anyway. And for the first time in her life, the world answered back. When the 911 operator heard her trembling voice, the confusion was immediate. The girl spoke carefully, her sentences broken by fear. She said she didn't know her exact address. She said her parents were hurting her siblings. She said they were being chained, beaten, starved. She said they couldn't breathe properly inside that house. The operator paused, unsure if this was a misunderstanding or something far more sinister. Her voice cracked as she repeated the word, "help." And in the silence that followed, the operator heard a truth no one could ignore. Officers were dispatched quickly. The girl waited on the sidewalk, clutching the phone like a lifeline. When the patrol car approached, she froze. She had never spoken to an outsider, never walked freely, never breathed air without fear. The officer saw a girl who looked years younger than her real age, thin, pale, trembling, eyes wide like she was seeing the world for the first time. She explained everything, her words hesitant but honest. And with every sentence, the officer realized that this wasn't a runaway incident. This was something far deeper, far darker. Within minutes, police cars surrounded the Turpin home. Inside, the officers found a scene they would never forget. The smell was overpowering, the rooms filthy, the children weak and frightened. Some were chained to beds with padlocks. Others stood still like statues, as if movement itself was forbidden. They spoke softly, nervously, unsure if speaking was even allowed. Their bodies were frail, their eyes carried years of silent suffering. The parents stood at the doorway, confused yet bizarrely calm, insisting that everything was fine. But the truth was everywhere, in the bruises, in the chains, in the faces of children who had lived their whole lives without sunlight, food, or love. And on that night, the nightmare finally cracked open. For the first time in years, the Turpin children were not captives. They were victims being seen. When the officers stepped deeper into the Turpin house, the truth unfolded in slow, unsettling layers, each one worse than the last. The air was heavy with an unbearable odor, the kind that doesn't come from a single day of neglect, but from years of decay and confinement. It clung to the walls, the furniture, the carpet. Every inch of the house whispered the same silent story of suffering. One of the officers opened a bedroom door and froze. A child, barely able to lift her head, sat on a bed with a chain wrapped around her ankle. The chain rattled softly as she tried to sit upright, her face pale, her expression blank, like she had forgotten how to react to the presence of help. Another officer found a boy shackled to a bed frame, his limbs thin like they were carved from bone. These were not just children, they were survivors of a nightmare that had lasted their entire lives. The siblings spoke in soft voices, some barely audible. They explained that they were often denied food as punishment, sometimes going days without a single proper meal. They weren't allowed to bathe, some of them hadn't showered in months. Their parents fed them only enough to keep them alive, but never enough to let them grow. Their bodies looked half their age, fragile like glass that could crack under the slightest pressure. One officer picked up a journal one of the older girls had hidden under a mattress. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, documenting punishments, hunger, fear, and the rare moments when hope flickered inside her. It was the kind of document that didn't just describe a home, it exposed a prison built in the middle of an ordinary neighborhood, invisible to everyone except those trapped inside. When the children were taken outside, they blinked at the daylight like it was something foreign. Some shielded their eyes with their hands, others stared at the sky for long, quiet moments, unsure if this sudden freedom was real or another cruel trick. Paramedics rushed in, checking each child one by one. Interviews would later reveal that most of them had never seen a doctor, had never gone to school, had never learned basic knowledge children their age naturally pick up. Their entire existence had been locked behind a door with no key. Meanwhile, their parents, David and Louise Turpin, were escorted into patrol cars. Their expressions were strangely calm, as if none of this was unusual. David spoke politely, his tone eerily normal, trying to explain their parenting methods as if he was discussing routine house rules. Louise looked confused, defensive, insisting that she loved her children, that she took good care of them, that outsiders wouldn't understand their strict lifestyle. But their words were hollow compared to the undeniable evidence around them. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, a disturbing picture emerged. The abuse had begun years earlier, escalating slowly as the children grew older. Isolation became control, control became torture, and torture became the only language the household understood. The parents kept the world out so effectively that even relatives rarely saw the children. And when they did, something always felt strange, too quiet, too controlled, too hidden. But no one imagined the truth. The authorities brought the children to safety, giving them food, water, blankets, and warmth, simple things that were luxuries in their old life. Some of the younger ones didn't know how to play with toys handed to them. Some didn't know what ordinary phrases meant. One child tried to save part of her meal, hiding the rest out of habit, afraid she wouldn't be fed again. These small behaviors revealed years of conditioning, years of being denied the most basic human needs. In the days that followed, the story spread across the country, then across the world. The quiet street in Paris, California became a symbol of hidden horror. People asked the same question: how could this happen without anyone noticing? How could suffering like this hide in plain sight? And with every answer reporters uncovered, the case grew darker, more unsettling. But for the 13 siblings, now finally free, the story was just beginning. Freedom felt unfamiliar, but hope felt real for the first time. And as the investigation deepened, the world realized the unimaginable truth. The Turpin children had survived years of torment, but now they were stepping into a life they had never been allowed to dream about. The days after the rescue felt like watching two different worlds collide. On one side were the Turpin children, finally breathing air that wasn't poisoned with fear, trying to understand what freedom meant. On the other side were investigators, therapists, prosecutors, and doctors, all trying to untangle a story so disturbing that even seasoned professionals struggled to process it. Medical examinations revealed the truth no one could deny. Some of the older children were so malnourished their bodies had stopped growing years earlier. Their muscles were weak, their bones fragile, their skin marked with scars that spoke a language of silent suffering. One doctor later said that their physical condition didn't match their real ages. Another explained that many of them had vitamin deficiencies they had only read about in medical textbooks. These weren't just signs of abuse, they were signs of prolonged imprisonment. Psychologists began working with them gently, step by careful step. They learned that the children had developed their own strange vocabulary, their own patterns of speech shaped by isolation. Some had never seen a police officer. Some didn't know how money worked. Many of them had no sense of time, no idea what year it was, what day it was, or what life outside the house looked like. Meanwhile, the Turpin parents sat in a courtroom surrounded by lawyers, reporters, and the quiet tension of a nation demanding justice. David Turpin looked stiff and expressionless, while Louise tried to speak softly, sometimes crying, sometimes insisting she was a loving mother. But their tears were overshadowed by the evidence the prosecutors laid bare. Photographs of chains, videos found inside the house, journal entries recovered from the children, medical records detailing years of starvation and neglect. The courtroom grew colder with every piece of evidence, every testimony, every revelation that confirmed the unimaginable. The judge listened carefully, his face stern, his eyes reflecting the weight of the case. When the children testified, their voices trembled, but their words were steady. They described nights of fear, days of punishment, the constant hunger, the feeling of being watched, controlled, silenced. Their courage in that courtroom was something the world would never forget. Eventually, David and Louise Turpin pleaded guilty to multiple counts: torture, false imprisonment, child cruelty, and abuse that had lasted more than a decade. The judge delivered a sentence that echoed through the courtroom: 25 years to life in prison. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was enough to ensure the safety of the children they had once controlled like captives. When the sentence was read, some of the siblings cried quietly, not because they missed their parents, but because a chapter they never asked for was finally closing. For the first time, their future belonged to them. Slowly, their lives began to change. They started attending school, learning at their own pace, discovering the world step by step. One learned to ride a bicycle, another learned how to cook. A few started expressing their dreams, becoming nurses, writers, or musicians. Therapists monitored their progress, celebrating small victories, a smile, a laugh, a moment of trust. These were milestones that would seem ordinary to others, but meant everything to them. The community stepped forward to help, but there were challenges too. Not every system designed to protect them worked the way it should, and they faced setbacks in foster care, financial support, and everyday adjustment. But despite everything, their journey toward healing continued. Slowly, painfully, courageously. They were no longer prisoners, they were survivors. Even years later, the Turpin case remains one of the most disturbing stories in American history. A reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, behind quiet doors and polite smiles. But it is also a reminder of something stronger, the resilience of children who, despite years of darkness, still found the strength to seek the light. And as we close this story here, the message remains clear. Their journey isn't just a case to study or a crime to retell. It's a testament to how powerful hope can be, even when it is held by the weakest hands. If you want more true crime stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.